20 years of silence. Not a single call answered, not a single gift opened. Then one day, a lavish birthday invitation from her own daughter appeared at her door, and the elderly mother thought it was a miraculous reunion. But behind the dazzling lights of the party lay a cold conspiracy aimed at the last bit of money she had left. Today's story will leave you breathless with the cruelty of blood ties. Watch until the end, and leave a comment with the city you're currently in, so I know how far my story has progressed. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and for 20 years I was a ghost in my own family. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this. I wasn't always invisible. There was a time when my house was the loudest, warmest place on the block. Sunday dinners that ran until midnight, a kitchen that always smelled like something simmering, two kids fighting over the last piece of cornbread while their father laughed so hard he had to sit down. That was my life once. I had it, and then, piece by piece, I watched it get taken away from me. And the worst part, the part that still makes my hand shake when I think about it, is that nobody took it. I just got left behind. I was 69 years old the year this story really starts. Though if you want the truth, it started decades before that, slow and quiet, the way most heartbreak does. Not in one big explosion. In silence. In all the ways silence can kill a person without ever raising its voice. My husband, Walter, died when I was 49. Cancer, the fast kind, the kind that doesn't give you time to say the things you meant to say. One spring, he was teaching our son how to fix the gutters, and by the following winter, I was standing in a black dress at a funeral home, picking out a casket, because I couldn't stand the thought of him in anything ugly. That was the first time my world tilted sideways. It would not be the last. I had two children, Vanessa and Brandon. Vanessa was the oldest, sharp as a tack from the time she could talk, the kind of girl who corrected her teachers and usually turned out to be right. She married young to a man named Richard Cole, a real estate developer with a smile so polished it looked rehearsed, and within a few years she had transformed herself into someone I barely recognized, the kind of woman who talked about optics and circles and the right kind of people. I used to tell myself she was just growing into herself. Now I think she was just growing away from me. Brandon was younger, softer, or at least he used to be. He went into finance, made good money fast, and somewhere along the way he picked up his sister's habit of looking at me like I was a problem to be managed instead of a mother to be loved. I don't know which of them changed first. I only know that by the time Walter had been gone 2 years, both of my children had quietly, almost politely, stopped needing me. It didn't happen all at once. That's the cruelest part. If it had happened all at once, I could have pointed to a single day and said, "There, that's when I lost them." Instead, it happened in inches. A birthday call that got shorter every year. A Christmas card that arrived later and later, until eventually it just didn't come at all. An invitation to dinner that got rescheduled 3 times and then never rescheduled again. I used to call Vanessa every Sunday, same as I had when Walter was alive, same time, like it was church. For the first year after he died, she'd pick up. "Hi, Mom," she'd say, in that voice people use when they're already looking at their watch. The calls got shorter, then they got rarer. Then one Sunday I called and got her voicemail, and I told myself she was just busy. And the Sunday after that I called and got her voicemail again. And somewhere around the 40th or 50th time I stopped pretending I didn't understand what was happening. My son was worse, in a way, because at least Vanessa pretended for a while. Brandon just stopped. No big fight, no terrible words said in anger that we could have apologized for later. He just faded the way a photograph fades if you leave it in the sun too long, until one day you look at it and the people in it are barely there at all. I want to tell you, I fought for them. I did. God, I fought. I called hundreds of times. I'm not exaggerating that number, I counted once, in a moment of pure foolishness, like counting would somehow prove something to somebody. I sent birthday cards every single year, even after I stopped getting any kind of response, even after the silence made it clear nobody was opening them. I mailed gifts I genuinely could not afford. A hand-stitched quilt for my granddaughter I'd never met, a little leather wallet for a grandson whose voice I'd never heard. I spent money I didn't have, on people who didn't seem to want it, because some stubborn, foolish part of me believed that if I just loved them hard enough, long enough, Eventually, they would remember that I existed. Eventually, I had grandchildren I had never met. 3 of them. I knew their names from a distance, the way you know the name of a celebrity's kid. Madison, Tyler, Little Grace, the youngest, who I'd seen exactly once in a photograph Vanessa had posted online. A photo I'd had to ask a neighbor's teenage daughter to help me find because I didn't understand the internet well enough to look for it myself. I had a granddaughter I had never held. Let that sit with you for a second, because it sat with me for 20 years, and it never once got lighter. People ask me sometimes, well, they ask me now, after everything. They didn't ask me then because nobody knew to ask. They say, Eleanor, why didn't you just stop trying? Why did you keep reaching out to people who clearly didn't want you? And the honest answer is that I didn't know how to stop being their mother. That's not a job you get to resign from just because nobody's clocking in to be your children anymore. I kept thinking, this year they'll call. This year they'll remember. My birthday is in March, not April. The way Vanessa always used to mix it up when she was little. And I used to think it was the sweetest, funniest thing that my own daughter couldn't remember the day I was born. I kept thinking it would turn around. I kept thinking love that big couldn't just disappear. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters. I wasn't some saint standing in the wreckage of other people's selfishness. I made my own mistakes too. I know there were years right after Walter died when I leaned on my children too hard, when I called too much, when I let my grief turn into a kind of weight I expected them to help me carry, and maybe that's part of what pushed them away in the beginning. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was perfect, because I wasn't, and the people in this story weren't either. None of us were. But there's a difference between 2 people growing apart because life happened to them, and what happened to me. What happened to me was deliberate. It just took me 20 years to understand that. By the time I turned 69, I had built myself a small, quiet life that didn't depend on my children remembering I was alive. I'd sold the big house, the one with the kitchen that used to smell like Sunday dinner, and moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the edge of town, the kind with thin walls and a parking spot I had to share with my upstairs neighbor, a retired school teacher named Carol, who became, without either of us really deciding it, the closest thing I had to family. Carol and I had coffee most mornings. We went to the matinee on Tuesdays because the tickets were cheaper. She knew about Vanessa and Brandon, knew the whole sad shape of it, and she never once told me to give up on them, even when I think she wanted to, because she understood something it took me a long time to understand myself, that giving up isn't really a choice you make once. It's something you have to keep choosing, over and over, every single day, and some days you're just not strong enough to choose it. That was my life. Quiet, small, lonely, in a way I'd gotten almost good at hiding, even from myself. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, an envelope arrived that changed everything. I remember the day with a clarity that almost embarrasses me, considering how everything that came after made a fool of me. I'd just gotten back from the matinee with Carol. We'd seen some romantic comedy I don't even remember the name of now. And I was sorting through my mail at the little table by the door, the way I did every day, mostly bills, a flyer for a grocery store, nothing that mattered. And then there it was. Cream-colored cardstock, heavier than anything else in the stack, with gold foil lettering that caught the afternoon light coming through my window. My name was written on the front in calligraphy so elegant it looked like it belonged in a museum. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. My hands were shaking before I even opened it. I want you to understand that shaking at 69 years old over a piece of mail because some wounded, hopeful part of me already knew, or thought it knew, who it was from. I sat down at my kitchen table. I made myself a cup of tea first, if you can believe that, because I needed a minute to prepare myself, the way you brace yourself before stepping into cold water. And then I opened it. It was an invitation to a birthday celebration. Vanessa's 50th birthday, posted at her home, black tie, a date circled in gold ink 3 weeks out. And at the bottom, in handwriting I recognized even after all those years, handwriting that used to sign my own report cards back when I helped her with homework at our kitchen table. Mom, so it's been too long. Please come. We have so much to talk about. Love, Vanessa. I sat there and I cried, like I hadn't cried since Walter's funeral. I called Carol upstairs before I'd even finished reading it twice. She came down still in her bathrobe, and I shoved the invitation into her hands like it was something fragile and miraculous. And I watched her read it, and I watched her face do something complicated. Happy for me, but careful, the way you look at someone standing too close to the edge of something. Eleanor, she said slowly, handing it back, this is wonderful. I'm happy for you, I really am. But, I said, because I could hear the but sitting right behind her teeth. But nothing, she said too quickly, and then, because she was a terrible liar and we both knew it, she added, just be careful with your heart, that's all. 20 years is a long time. I didn't want to hear it. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't want to hear caution. I didn't want to hear careful. I wanted to feel, for the first time in 2 decades, like my daughter had finally remembered I existed. Like maybe somewhere in that polished, successful life of hers, some small piece of the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during car rides still remembered what it felt like to love me. She wrote it herself, I told Carol, like that was proof of something. Look at the handwriting. She didn't have an assistant do this. I know, Carol said gently. I see that. She said we have so much to talk about. I see that too, honey. Maybe she's finally ready, I said, and my voice cracked right down the middle on the word ready, because some part of me had been waiting 20 years to say that sentence out loud. Carol hugged me. She didn't say anything else, which I think now was its own kind of kindness, because there wasn't anything else useful to say to a woman who'd already decided to hope. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed with the invitation on my nightstand where I could see the shape of it in the dark, and I let myself imagine the whole thing, every detail, the way you do when you've been starving for something for so long that even the smallest taste of it makes you drunk. I imagined walking into Vanessa's house and seeing my grandchildren for the first time, really seeing them, not in some grainy photo a teenager had to find for me. And I imagined little Grace looking up at me with no idea who I was, and then someone saying, "This is your grandmother," and I imagined the moment that confusion turned into something warmer, something like recognition, even though we'd never met. I imagined Brandon shaking my hand and then, after a beat, pulling me into a hug instead, the way he used to hug me when he was a boy, and something good had happened, this full-body, unguarded thing. I imagined Vanessa taking my hand at some point during the party, pulling me aside and saying, "Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry it took so long. I'm sorry for all the years I let go by." I built an entire reunion in my head that night, brick by brick, the way you build a house you desperately need to live in. And here's the thing I need you to understand, the thing that still makes my chest hurt when I think about it. I built it so carefully, with such desperate hope, that there was no room left in it for doubt. Carol's warning sat somewhere in the back of my mind, but I'd buried it under 20 years of wanting, and wanting, when it's old enough and deep enough, can make a person believe almost anything. The next morning, I called the number on the invitation's RSVP card to confirm. A woman's voice answered. Not Vanessa's, some assistant or event coordinator, I never did find out which, and took down my name with a kind of brisk efficiency that should have told me something, though I didn't let it. "And will you be attending alone, Mrs. Hayes, or bringing a guest?" "Alone," I said. "Just me." "Wonderful. We'll have a seat reserved for you. The dress code is formal, so black tie." I hung up the phone and sat there in my little kitchen in my little apartment, with my heart doing something it hadn't done in 20 years, something that felt dangerously close to joy. I want to tell you about the next 3 weeks, because I think you need to understand exactly how much I gave to this moment, exactly how much hope I poured into it, so that you understand exactly how much there was to lose. I didn't have money to spare. I want to be clear about that, because it matters for everything that comes later. I lived on a fixed income. What was left of Walter's pension, my Social Security, the modest interest on what I'd saved from selling the house. It was enough to live on, carefully, if I didn't make foolish decisions. I had, over the years, made very few foolish decisions. I clipped coupons. I bought generic. I hadn't bought myself a new dress in probably 6 years. But this felt different. This felt like the one time in my life when caution didn't matter. Because what was the point of having savings if you didn't spend it on the thing you'd been praying for? I went to 3 different department stores before I found the dress. A deep emerald green, floor length, with a modest neckline and sleeves that covered my arms. I'd gotten self-conscious about my arms somewhere in my 60s, the way you do. And when I tried it on in the dressing room mirror, I almost didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked like someone who belonged at a 50th birthday party in a mansion. She looked, for just a second, like someone's mother who mattered. It cost more than I should have spent. I told myself it didn't matter. Then there was the gift. I agonized over the gift more than anything else, because somehow it felt like the gift needed to say everything I hadn't been able to say in 20 years of unanswered calls. I finally settled on a silver jewelry box, hand-engraved, with Vanessa's name and the date of her birth on the lid, and inside, nestled in blue velvet, a strand of pearls that had belonged to my own mother, the only piece of real jewelry I had left from my side of the family, something I'd always planned to give Vanessa eventually, on some occasion I'd imagined would matter. I thought foolishly that this would be the occasion. I had it appraised before I wrapped it, just out of curiosity, and the jeweler told me it was worth more than I expected. $8,000, give or take, for the pearls alone, not counting the box. I remember standing in that little shop and thinking, it doesn't matter what it's worth. It's not about what it's worth. It's about what it means. I want you to remember that I thought that. I want you to remember how sure I was. The 3 weeks crawled by and then somehow raced. Carol helped me pick out shoes. She did my hair the morning of the party, sitting me down at her kitchen table the way she used to do for her students' mothers back when she taught at the local elementary school, curling it carefully, telling me I looked beautiful, telling me to have a wonderful time. And then, right at the end, right as I was getting ready to leave, she took my hands in hers and looked at me with an expression I didn't fully understand until much later. "Eleanor," she said, "whatever happens tonight, you call me. Doesn't matter what time it is, you call me." "Carol, it's a birthday party," I laughed. "Not an emergency." "I know," she said. "Just promise me." "I promise," I said, mostly to make her stop looking at me like that. I drove out to Vanessa's house. I'd looked up the address online, with Carol's help, since I'd never actually been there. And the closer I got, the more my hands tightened on the steering wheel, the more my heart climbed up into my throat. The neighborhood changed gradually, and then suddenly, modest houses giving way to bigger ones giving way to estates set so far back from the road you could barely see them through the trees, gates with intercoms, hedges trimmed into perfect rectangles. And then there it was, Vanessa's house. House feels like the wrong word, honestly. It was the kind of place you see in magazines, white stone and enormous windows glowing gold from the inside, a circular driveway already crowded with luxury cars, valets in black vests directing traffic like the place was a hotel instead of somebody's home. I sat in my own car, a 12-year-old sedan that suddenly felt very small and very tired, and I stared up at that house and I thought, my daughter lives here. My daughter has been living here this whole time, in a house like a palace, while I clipped coupons in a 2-bedroom apartment and wondered if she still remembered my birthday. I should have felt something then. Some warning, some flicker of the thing Carol had tried to plant in me. What I actually felt was pride. Look how well she's done, I thought. Look at everything she's built. And some desperate part of me added, maybe she's finally ready to share it with me. A valet opened my door. I handed him my keys with hands that were shaking again, this time from nerves instead of joy, and I walked up the wide stone steps toward the enormous front doors, clutching my silver gift box against my chest like a shield. The party was already in full swing when I stepped inside, and the sheer scale of it stole my breath. A string quartet played somewhere off to the side. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of champagne and tiny, elaborate appetizers I didn't recognize. The ceiling soared 2 stories above us, hung with chandeliers that threw light across at least 100 guests, all of them dressed like they'd stepped out of a magazine, all of them laughing, the particular laugh of people who'd never once worried about money in their lives. I stood just inside the doorway for a long moment, completely overwhelmed, searching the crowd for a familiar face and finding none. A waiter offered me champagne. I took it mostly to have something to do with my hands. It took almost 20 minutes before I spotted Vanessa. She was across the room, near a towering floral arrangement that must have cost more than my monthly rent. laughing at something a guest had said. Golden hair swept up, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my car. For a moment I just stood there and looked at her, my daughter, 50 years old now, more beautiful and polished than I'd ever seen her, and something in my chest cracked open with a kind of aching love I hadn't let myself feel in years. I started toward her. "Vanessa," I called out when I was close enough, my voice catching on her name. She turned, and I watched, in real time, her face do something I will never forget for as long as I live. A flicker, fast as a blink, of pure surprise, almost alarm, instantly smoothed over into something practiced and pleasant. "Mom," she said, "you made it. Not you came. Not, I'm so glad to see you. You made it." Like I was a delivery she'd been waiting on. "Of course I made it," I said, trying to laugh, trying to make it light. "I wouldn't have missed this for the world." She air-kissed my cheek, the kind of kiss that doesn't actually touch skin, and I caught, just for a second, the scent of her perfume, expensive and unfamiliar, nothing like the drugstore stuff she used to wear as a teenager. "You look nice," she said, eyes already flicking past me, scanning the room. "Did you find parking okay? I should introduce you around. There's so many people here you don't know." "Vanessa," I said, before she could pull away. "It's so good to see you. It's been—" "I know," she said, cutting me off, smooth as glass. "It's been a long time. We have to catch up properly. Later, it's so crazy right now with all these people. You understand?" I understood. And I told myself I didn't, both at the same time, the way you can hold two contradictory things in your chest when you desperately need one of them to be true. She introduced me to a small cluster of guests. "This is my mother, Eleanor." And I shook hands and smiled and made small talk about nothing. And the entire time I watched Vanessa's eyes drift over my shoulder, looking for someone more interesting to talk to, and after about 90 seconds she excused herself with a hand on my arm and a "I'll find you later, I promise," that I somehow already knew was a lie. I drifted through that party like a ghost at my own daughter's birthday. I found Brandon about an hour in, near the bar, deep in conversation with two men in expensive suits, talking about something, stocks or real estate, or some deal I didn't understand. And when I touched his arm, he turned, and for 1/2 of 1 second I watched my son not recognize me. Actually not recognize me. Just blankness. A stranger's polite confusion before it cleared and became something worse. Recognition followed immediately by discomfort. "Mom," he said. "Hey, wow, you're here." "Brandon." I reached up. He'd always been taller than me, even as a teenager, and touched his cheek the way I used to when he was small, and he stiffened under my hand in a way that made my stomach drop. "Look at you. You look so—" "Yeah, it's been a while," he said, stepping back slightly, just enough that my hand fell away. He turned half toward the men he'd been talking to. "Guys, this is my mother." One of them said something polite. I don't remember what. I was too busy noticing that my son had introduced me to strangers the same flat way you'd introduce a coworker, not the way you'd introduce your mother at your sister's 50th birthday party after 20 years apart. "Can we talk?" I asked him quietly, once the men had drifted off toward the bar. "Just for a minute. I've missed you so much, Brandon. Mom, it's a party," he said, with a short laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "There's like 200 people here. Let's not do the heart-to-heart thing right now, okay? Later. We'll find time." Later. That word again. I would hear it so many times that night that it started to feel like a sound instead of a word, something with no meaning left in it at all. I want to tell you about the moment I understood, really understood, that something was wrong. Not just the ordinary wrongness of awkward distance after 20 years, but something deliberate, something engineered. It came about 2 hours into the party, when I'd finally found a quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows, nursing a second glass of champagne I didn't really want, watching my own family's party happen around me like I was watching it through glass. A woman approached me, older than the other guests, kind-faced, holding a drink of her own. "You must be Eleanor," she said. "Vanessa's mother. I've heard so much about you." Something in me brightened despite everything. "You have?" "Oh yes," the woman said. "Richard's been talking about the beach property for weeks. Such an exciting project. You must be thrilled to be part of it." I blinked at her. "The beach property?" "The estate," she said, looking slightly confused now, like she'd assumed I already knew. "On the coast. Richard showed us the renderings. It's going to be extraordinary. 8 bedrooms, I think he said. A private dock." She must have seen something shift in my face because she added, more carefully, "I just assumed, since your family, that you'd be, well, investing alongside them. That's usually how these things work, isn't it? Keeping it in the family." I stood there holding my champagne glass with a smile frozen on my face, feeling something cold settle into my stomach, something I didn't have a name for yet but would, very soon, understand completely. "I should let you get back to the party," I managed to say, and the woman smiled and drifted off, leaving me standing alone by the window with my heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with joy anymore. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important, even though it embarrasses me now. I felt suspicion. A real, genuine flicker of suspicion, sharp enough that my hands went cold around the glass. And then, and this is the part that still makes me angry at myself even now, I talked myself out of it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that 20 years of hurt had made me see conspiracies in ordinary conversation, that a woman I'd just met making small talk about a real estate project didn't mean anything sinister, that my daughter inviting me to her birthday after 2 decades of silence could simply be what it looked like, a reunion, a chance. Love, finally remembering where it lived. I wanted so badly to believe that. I think some part of me chose to believe it. The way you choose to believe a lie you've already decided you can't survive without. I didn't know yet. Couldn't have known, not really, not with the part of my mind that still trusted my own children, that the evening had barely begun to show me its true shape. I didn't know that somewhere in that glittering crowd, my daughter and my son and the smiling, polished man my daughter had married were watching the clock, waiting for the right moment, the moment when enough champagne had been poured and enough guests had gathered to bring me up onto a small raised platform at the front of the ballroom, under a spotlight, in front of everyone I didn't know, and show me exactly why I had really been invited. I finished my champagne. I set the empty glass down on a passing tray. And somewhere in the back of that enormous, glittering room, I heard someone tap a microphone, heard Richard Cole's smooth, confident voice rise above the string quartet, asking everyone for their attention, asking Vanessa's mother, "Please, would Eleanor come on up here? We have something we want to share with everyone tonight." And I remember the way my whole body went still, the way some animal instinct older than 20 years of hope rose up in my chest and told me, very clearly, that I should not walk toward that stage. I walked toward it anyway. I always did, with them. I always walked toward whatever they asked of me, even when something in my gut was screaming at me to run. The crowd parted for me the way crowds do when they sense something is about to happen, that particular electric hush falling over a room full of strangers who can smell drama coming before they understand its shape. Richard's hand found my elbow before I'd even reached the platform, guiding me up the 2 short steps with a gentleness that, looking back, makes my skin crawl. At the time, I mistook it for tenderness. I climbed those steps thinking my son-in-law was being kind to his wife's elderly mother. I did not yet understand that I was being arranged. The spotlight hit me, and I froze the way a deer freezes, blinking against the brightness, suddenly aware of 200 strangers' faces turned up toward me like flowers toward the sun. I found Vanessa first. She was standing just to my left, her smile a beautiful, terrible thing, fixed in place like something painted on. Brandon stood on my right, and when I glanced at him, hoping for some flicker of the boy who used to hold my hand crossing the street, he wouldn't meet my eyes at all. He was looking at his shoes. "Everyone," Richard said into the microphone, his voice carrying that easy, practiced warmth of a man who'd given 100 toasts at 100 parties just like this one. "I know tonight is about celebrating Vanessa, and we're going to get back to that in just a moment. But first, I wanted to take a second to recognize someone very special who's joined us tonight. This is Eleanor, Vanessa's mother." A polite ripple of applause moved through the crowd. I stood there with my hands clasped in front of me, my silver gift box still sitting somewhere on a table I'd left it on, my heart hammering against my ribs in a rhythm I didn't like at all, because something about the way Richard said joined us tonight, something about the careful, rehearsed cadence of it, told me this wasn't really about celebrating me. For those of you who don't know, Richard went on, our family has been working on something incredible. A project we've been dreaming about for years. We're calling it Cole Coastal, 8 bedrooms, private beach access, a property that's going to be the centerpiece of everything we build together as a family for the next generation. He clicked something in his hand, and behind him, on a screen I hadn't even noticed lowering from the ceiling, an architectural rendering bloomed into view. White stone, glass walls, a swimming pool that seemed to spill directly into the ocean beyond it. Gasps moved through the crowd. Someone near the front said something about how stunning it was, how ambitious. I stood there under the spotlight looking at a picture of a house that cost more than I would make in 3 lifetimes. Still not understanding, not really, not yet, why I was standing on a stage next to it. This project represents everything our family has worked for, Richard continued, and now his eyes found mine, and I felt the first cold finger of dread trace its way down my spine, because there was something in that look that wasn't warmth at all. It was calculation. And we wanted tonight, Vanessa's 50th birthday, surrounded by the people we love most, to be the moment we officially welcome Eleanor into this next chapter. Into the family business, you might say. The applause this time was louder, more genuine, people clapping for a sentiment they thought was sweet, a mother finally being brought back into the fold. I clapped too, instinctively, stupidly, my hands moving before my mind had caught up to what was actually happening. "Mom," Vanessa said, turning to me now, taking my hand in both of hers, and for one terrible, hopeful second, I thought, here it is, here's the apology, here's the moment I've been waiting 20 years for. Her hands were cold. I remember that very clearly. Her hands were cold and her smile didn't reach her eyes at all. We know it's been hard, the distance, the silence. We want to make it right, and we think this, building something together as a family, this is how we do that. "Vanessa," I said quietly, "what are you talking about?" "The investment, Mom." Brandon spoke for the first time, stepping closer, and his voice had an edge to it now, something impatient underneath the smoothness, something that made me feel, for the first time all night, genuinely afraid. "We need the family fully on board. Vanessa told me you sold the house a few years back. We know you've got savings sitting in some boring account doing nothing. This is a chance to actually do something with it. Be part of something real." The spotlight felt suddenly very hot. I could feel sweat gathering at the back of my neck, could feel 200 strangers' eyes on me, waiting, and somewhere in the back of that crowd I thought I saw the kind-faced woman from earlier, the one who'd mentioned the beach property, watching me with an expression that had shifted from curious to something almost like pity. "How do you know what I have in my accounts?" I asked, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to, smaller than I needed it to be in that moment. Vanessa and Brandon exchanged a look. It was fast, but I caught it, the way you catch a flash of movement at the edge of your vision. A look that said something had already been discussed between them, something I wasn't part of, something that had been decided long before that envelope with the gold foil lettering ever found its way to my door. "We hired someone," Vanessa said, and at least she had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable saying it out loud, in front of all those people, under that light. "An accountant, just to understand the family's financial picture. Make sure everyone's protected going forward." "You hired someone to investigate me," I said. The words came out flat, disbelieving, like I was translating a foreign language in real time and didn't quite trust my own translation. "It's not investigating, Mom. Don't be dramatic," Brandon snapped. And there it was. There was the real him, the version that had been hiding under 20 years of polite distance, impatient and sharp and entitled in a way that made my chest ache with a grief I didn't have words for yet. "It's due diligence. Richard's firm does it for every investor. You're not special, you're just family, which honestly should make this easier, not harder. You're not special, you're just family." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to sit with it, standing under that spotlight in my second-hand emerald dress with my dead husband's pearls sitting forgotten on a gift table somewhere behind me. 20 years of silence, and the first real thing my son said to me in front of 200 strangers was that I wasn't special, that I was just a line item, just family, the way you'd describe a tax bracket or a clause in a contract. Richard stepped forward then, smooth as ever, sensing maybe that the moment was slipping sideways, that the warm, generous story he'd been telling the room was starting to show its seams. He put a hand on my shoulder, and I flinched away from it before I could stop myself. "Eleanor," he said, voice pitched low now, for me alone, though the microphone was still close enough that I'm sure some of it carried. "We have everything ready. The paperwork's been drawn up already, actually. We wanted to be efficient, save you the hassle. All we need tonight is your signature, and you're officially part of the Cole Coastal Family Trust. 200,000, that's the figure our accountant came up with, based on your current liquid assets. It's an investment, not a gift. You'll get equity. You'll get returns." $200,000. Almost everything I had left in the world. I stood there and I felt the floor tilt under me, the same way it had tilted the day Walter died. The same sickening lurch of a world rearranging itself into a shape I didn't recognize. I looked at my daughter's face, searching for some sign that this had been a misunderstanding, that surely she hadn't spent 20 years letting me believe I'd been forgotten, only to summon me back the exact moment her family needed money. I looked at my son's face, hoping to find the boy who used to cry when I left for work in the mornings, hoping he was somewhere in there, buried under whatever this version of him had become. I didn't find either of them. I found two well-dressed strangers waiting for me to sign a piece of paper. "You investigated my finances," I said again, louder this time, my voice shaking now. Not with sadness, but with something hotter, something I hadn't let myself feel toward my own children in 20 years. "Before you ever sent that invitation, you knew exactly how much money I had. You knew it before you ever picked up the phone and called the venue, before you ever wrote, 'It's been too long, Mom,' in that card." "Mom, don't make this into something ugly," Vanessa said, and there was real irritation in her voice now, the mask slipping, the polished hostess giving way to something colder underneath. "This is a good thing. This is us including you. Do you know how many families never give their elderly parents the chance to be part of something like this? We're trying to bring you in." Elderly. She called me elderly in front of 200 people, like I was a liability to be managed instead of the woman who'd sat up with her every single night for 2 weeks straight when she had chickenpox at age 6, who'd worked a second job the year Walter was between contracts so she could have ballet lessons, who'd cried alone in a parked car more times than I could count. Because crying in front of my children always felt like a burden I refused to put on them. 20 years, I said, and my voice cracked, but I kept going, because something in me had finally broken loose from the polite, hopeful woman who'd walked into that party 2 hours earlier. 20 years I called you, both of you, every birthday, every holiday. I sent gifts I couldn't afford. I left messages nobody answered. I have never once met my own granddaughter. And the first time either of you reaches out to me in 2 decades is to ask for $200,000 under a spotlight in front of strangers. The room had gone very quiet. I could feel it. That particular hush of 200 people realizing they were watching something they weren't supposed to be watching, something raw and real cutting through the champagne and the string quartet and the architectural renderings of a beach house I would never set foot in. "It's not like that," Brandon said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence, because even he could hear how it sounded, finally, out loud, in front of an audience. "Then what is it like?" I asked. "Tell me. Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what it is. You didn't invite your mother to a birthday party. You invited a bank account." "Mom, please," Vanessa said, and for one moment, just one, something flickered across her face that might have been real, might have been the first honest thing she'd shown me all night, something that looked almost like shame. But it vanished as fast as it came, smoothed back over by whatever version of her had learned to want things more than she wanted to be good. "Don't do this here. Don't embarrass us. Don't embarrass us. After everything. After 20 years of silence, after a financial investigation conducted behind my back, after being summoned across the room from a screen displaying my own potential ruin, the thing my daughter was worried about was being embarrassed. Not the years she'd stolen from me. Not the grandchildren I'd never held. Whether I might make a scene that would cost her something in front of her glittering, important friends. I looked out at the crowd. 200 strangers in black tie, holding champagne glasses, watching the unraveling of my family like it was dinner theater. Somewhere among them was the kind-faced woman who'd told me about the beach house, watching now with an expression that had fully tipped over into pity. And pity, I discovered in that moment, hurts almost as much as cruelty does. "You spent money you didn't have on a dress to come here," Richard said suddenly, quietly, and I turned to him in disbelief because of everything that had been said that night. This felt like the cruelest blow yet, that he knew somehow that they'd guessed at exactly how much I'd sacrificed to walk through that door and was using it against me now as proof of how much I wanted this, how desperate I was, how easy I should be to convince. "You clearly wanted to be part of this family again, Eleanor. This is your chance. Don't let pride get in the way of an opportunity that benefits everyone." I want to tell you that I had some perfect scripted response ready. I didn't. What I had was 20 years of swallowed grief rising up through my chest all at once, hot and sudden, and what came out of my mouth surprised even me. "You don't get to talk to me about pride," I said, my voice shaking but clear. Clear enough that it carried across that silent ballroom without any help from the microphone Richard was still holding loosely at his side. "You don't get to stand there in a house I didn't know existed, next to a screen showing off a beach mansion, and lecture me about letting pride get in the way. I have nothing left to be proud about except the fact that I never once gave up on either of you, even when you gave every single reason to." Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Brandon looked, for the first time all night, genuinely uncertain, like a man watching a plan come apart in real time and not knowing which thread to grab first. $200,000, I said, looking between them, between the daughter who'd worn cold hands and a warm smile, and the son who'd told me I wasn't special, just family. "That's almost everything I have left in this world. Do you understand that? That's not extra money sitting around doing nothing, the way you described it tonight in front of strangers. That's my whole life. That's everything Walter and I built. That's what's supposed to keep a roof over my head until the day I die, because neither of you have ever once asked whether I'd have somewhere to go if something happened to me. You didn't think about my future when you drew up that paperwork. You thought about yours." "Mom, that's not fair," Vanessa said, but her voice had lost its polish now, gone thin and defensive, and somewhere underneath the anger I could hear something that might have once been a little girl who didn't like being told she was wrong. "Fair," I repeated, and I actually laughed, a short, broken sound that surprised everyone, including me. "You want to talk to me about fair? I called you every Sunday for years, Vanessa. Every single Sunday, like church, and you let it go to voicemail more times than I can count, and then one day you stopped picking up entirely, and I told myself you were busy. I told myself 100 different stories so I wouldn't have to face the real one. And the real one is that you didn't want me in your life until you needed something from me. That's the truth. And you know it's the truth. And so does everyone standing in this room right now." Nobody in that crowd was pretending to look away anymore. They were watching openly, some of them with their phones lowered, like even the impulse to capture this for later had been overridden by the sheer discomfort of witnessing it live. "You think this is easy for us?" Brandon said suddenly, his voice rising, defensive now in a way that told me I'd finally cracked through whatever careful script they'd rehearsed for this moment. "You think it's easy growing up watching you fall apart after Dad died? Always needing something from us, always calling, always... God, Mom, you don't know what it was like being your kid. You made us your whole world, and it was suffocating." There it was. The thing underneath the thing. Years of resentment dressed up as grievance, twisted just enough to make it sound like I was the one who'd done something wrong. That my love itself had been the burden. That needing my children after losing my husband had somehow earned me 20 years of silence and a financial ambush at a birthday party. I felt something settle in me then. Not anger exactly. Anger had already come and mostly burned itself out in the last few minutes. But something colder, clearer. Something that felt almost like relief. The way it feels when a doctor finally tells you what's actually wrong with you after years of vague, unsatisfying answers. "I loved you," I said quietly, and the quiet of it seemed to carry further than the shouting had. "I loved you both more than anything in this world, and maybe I did it wrong sometimes. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I was a perfect mother, because I wasn't. I leaned on you too hard some years. I called too much. I know that. But loving my children too much is not a crime that deserves 20 years of punishment. And it is certainly not a debt that gets repaid with an invitation designed to drain my bank account. I looked at the paperwork sitting on a small podium near the edge of the stage, crisp and official, a pen resting on top of it like an invitation of its own, waiting for a signature that was supposed to be the entire point of the evening, the real reason for the gold foil lettering and the cream cardstock and the words, "It's been too long. Mom, please come." "I am not signing that," I said. "Mom, think about this," Vanessa said, stepping toward me, her voice dropping into something more pleading now that the cold confidence had cracked. "This is a chance for us to actually be a family again, to build something together. Don't throw that away over money." "You're the ones who turned it into money," I said. "I would have walked through fire for a real conversation with either of you, a phone call, a birthday card that didn't take 20 years to arrive. I didn't need a beach house. I needed my daughter to remember my birthday. I needed my son to call me back even once. That's all I ever wanted, and instead you waited until you needed something, and then you dressed it up in candlelight and string quartets and called it love." The silence that followed felt enormous, stretching out across that glittering ballroom, broken only by the faint, oblivious hum of the air conditioning and somewhere, far off, a single nervous clink of a champagne glass being set down too quickly. I looked at the paperwork one more time. I looked at the pen waiting on top of it. And then I looked at my daughter's face and my son's face. And I understood. With a clarity that felt almost peaceful after the chaos of the last 10 minutes, that whatever I said next was going to be the thing that decided the rest of my life. "No," I said. One word. I'd spent 20 years saying yes to every excuse, every silence, every disappointment, every birthday that came and went unmarked. And in that moment, under that spotlight, in front of 200 strangers and the only 2 children I would ever have, I finally said the one word I should have learned to say decades earlier. I turned away from the podium. I stepped down off that platform on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. And I walked through that crowd of stunned, silent guests, past the floral arrangement that cost more than my rent, past the gift table where my mother's pearls sat wrapped and forgotten. And I did not look back once. Not even when I heard Vanessa's voice calling after me. Not even when I heard Richard say something low and urgent to Brandon that I couldn't quite make out. I walked out through those enormous front doors into the cool October night, and I stood there on the stone steps for a moment, breathing in air that didn't smell like champagne or expensive perfume, and somewhere behind me, muffled now by the closed doors, I could hear the party trying, badly, to recover itself. The string quartet picking back up, voices rising in that brittle, overly bright way people talk when they're pretending nothing just happened. The valet brought my car around without quite meeting my eyes, and I think he must have heard something or seen something on my face, because he didn't ask if I'd had a good time the way valets usually do. I sat in my car in that circular driveway for a long moment before I turned the key, my hands finally steady, steadier than they'd been in 3 weeks, and I looked back up at that glowing white house one last time. I thought about Carol, waiting up for my call. I thought about my mother's pearls sitting on that table inside, and I felt a strange, hollow grief about leaving them behind, like leaving behind the last physical piece of a life I was about to walk away from entirely. And I thought, with a kind of cold, dawning certainty that would only grow sharper in the weeks that followed, they had shown me exactly who they were tonight, under that spotlight, in front of all those witnesses. The only mistake left to make now would be forgetting it. I called Carol the moment I pulled into my own driveway, sitting there in the dark with the engine ticking as it cooled, and she picked up before the first ring had even finished, like she'd been sitting by the phone the entire time, which, knowing Carol, she probably had been. "Eleanor?" Her voice was tight with worry. "It's almost 11. What happened?" I told her everything, sitting there in my car because I didn't trust my legs to carry me up the stairs yet, the words spilling out of me in a way that surprised even myself. The spotlight, the rendering of the beach house glowing on that enormous screen, the paperwork waiting on the podium like a trap dressed up as a celebration. Carol didn't say I told you so. I'll always love her for that. She just listened, and when I finally got to the part about walking out, about saying no and meaning it for the first time in 20 years, she let out a long breath I could hear even through the phone. "Good," she said simply. "Good for you, Eleanor." "I left the pearls," I said, And that, of all things, was what finally broke me, sitting in that cold car in my own driveway. My mother's pearls. I left them on that table and I didn't even think about going back for them. They're just pearls, Carol said gently. You're not just pearls. Come inside. I'll put the kettle on. I didn't sleep much that night, but I want you to understand something about the days that followed, because this is where the story takes a turn I didn't see coming, even after everything that had already happened. I thought foolishly that walking out of that ballroom was the end of it. I thought I'd said my piece, drawn my line, and that whatever relationship I had left with Vanessa and Brandon would simply settle into the silence it had been heading toward for 20 years anyway, just with a little more honesty attached to it now. I was wrong. What I'd actually done, without realizing it, was light a fuse. The call started 3 days later. Not apologies, Heat. I want to be very clear about that, because for one foolish, hopeful hour after the first call came in, I let myself believe that's what it might be. It was Vanessa, and her voice on the voicemail she left was tight and clipped in a way I'd never heard from her before, not even at the party. Mom, we need to talk. This isn't over. Call me back. This isn't over. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I understand why you're upset. This isn't over. Like I was the one who'd started something. Like walking away from a financial ambush at my own daughter's birthday party was an act of aggression that demanded a response. I didn't call back. I want to tell you that took strength, but honestly, in those first few days, it mostly took numbness. I was still moving through a kind of fog, replaying that spotlight over and over in my mind. My son's voice telling me I wasn't special, just family. My daughter calling me elderly in front of 200 strangers like I was a liability on a balance sheet. The second call came 2 days after that, and this time it was Brandon. And his message was longer, angrier, the careful, polished veneer from the party completely gone. Mom, seriously, this is ridiculous. You humiliated us in front of everyone we know. Do you have any idea what people are saying? Richard's business partners were there. Investors. You made a scene over an investment opportunity, like we were trying to scam you or something. And now people are asking questions. You need to call us back and fix this. Fix this. As though I were the one who owed an apology. As though 20 years of silence followed by a financial ambush under a spotlight was somehow a minor social misstep on my part rather than theirs. I didn't call back that time either, and I want to be honest with you. It was harder that time because some old, well-worn part of me, the part that had spent 2 decades trying to earn my children's love back through sheer persistence, wanted desperately to fix this, wanted to smooth it over, wanted to find some way to make everyone comfortable again, even if it meant swallowing my own dignity to do it. I sat with the phone in my hand for almost 20 minutes that evening, Brandon's number pulled up on the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button. Carol found me like that, sitting at my kitchen table with the phone glowing in my hand, and she didn't say anything at first. She just sat down across from me and waited, the way good friends know how to wait, until I finally set the phone down on the table, screen dark, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 3 days. I almost called him, I said. I know, Carol said. I don't know why it's still so hard, after everything, after what they did to me. Because you're their mother, Carol said simply. That doesn't turn off just because they were cruel to you. I think that's the hardest thing nobody tells you about all this. That loving someone and protecting yourself from them aren't the same instinct, and sometimes they pull in completely opposite directions, and you have to choose over and over which one wins. Hustle. I thought about that for a long time after she left that night. I thought about it lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying 20 years of one-sided phone calls and unopened gifts and birthdays that came and went unmarked, all of it leading up to a single night under a spotlight where my own children had finally shown me, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what I was worth to them. The third call I actually answered, mostly because it caught me off guard, my phone ringing while I had my hands full of groceries, and I picked up without checking the screen first, a reflex 20 years deep. It was Vanessa, and this time her voice had shifted again, gone softer, more pleading, the kind of voice that might have worked on me 3 weeks earlier, before that ballroom, before the spotlight. Mom, please, can we just talk? Just the two of us, no Richard, no Brandon. I think there's been a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding, I repeated, setting my grocery bags down on the counter slowly, my voice flat. I know how it looked, she said. I know the timing was bad, the way Richard presented it, it came across wrong. But Mom, we really do want you in our lives. This wasn't just about the money. Then why? I said, and I could hear my own voice shaking, not with sadness this time, but with something harder, something that had been hardening in me for 3 days. Did you have someone investigate my finances before you ever sent that invitation? Why did the paperwork already exist before I ever stepped through your door? If this was about reconnecting, Vanessa, where was the dinner? Where was the simple phone call asking how I'd been for the last 20 years? Why did the very first thing out of your mouth, after 2 decades of silence, have to do with a beach house? Silence on the other end of the line. A long one. Long enough that I almost thought she'd hung up. It's complicated, she finally said. Richard's business has had some setbacks this year. The coastal project, it's not optional anymore, Mom. We're already in too deep. We needed the capital, and when Richard found out you'd sold the house, that you had savings just sitting there, he thought... She stopped herself, but it was too late. The sentence had already done its damage, hanging there in the air between us, unfinished but completely clear. He thought I was an easy target, I finished for her, very quietly. He thought a lonely old woman who'd been begging for her children's attention for 20 years would sign anything if it meant finally getting invited back into the family. That's not, Vanessa started, but her voice cracked on the denial, and I think we both knew, in that moment, that I'd named the thing exactly. I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said, and something in me had gone very still and very clear, the way the ocean goes still right before a storm breaks. I am not signing anything, not now, not ever. And I think you should know that since that party, I've started asking some questions of my own, about this investigation, about who exactly you hired and what exactly they found, and whether digging into your own mother's private financial information without her knowledge or consent is something a lawyer might have an opinion about. Mom, don't threaten us, Vanessa said, her voice sharpening instantly, the softness evaporating. We're your children. You stopped acting like my children 20 years ago, I said. I'm simply catching up to that fact a little late. I hung up the phone and my hands were shaking, but underneath the shaking was something else, something that felt almost like power, the strange, unfamiliar sensation of having finally said the true thing instead of the comfortable thing. I want to tell you about Margaret Liu, because she became important very quickly after that, and I think it's worth understanding how I found her, because it wasn't an accident. After that phone call with Vanessa, after hearing my own daughter admit, even half admit, that I'd been deliberately targeted because of my finances and my loneliness, something in me shifted permanently. I stopped being a woman waiting to be loved and became instead a woman determined to protect what little I had left. Carol's nephew worked at a law firm downtown, and through him I got the name of an elder law attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Margaret Liu, who specialized in exactly the kind of situation I found myself in, though I didn't fully understand that until I sat across from her in her small, cluttered office and told her the whole story, start to finish. She listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, her expression giving nothing away until I finished, and then she set her pen down and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen directed at me in a very long time. Not pity, but respect. Mrs. Hayes, she said, what you're describing is, unfortunately, more common than you'd think. Adult children, sometimes with the encouragement of a spouse, identifying an aging parent's assets and engineering a reconciliation specifically to gain access to them. There's actually a term for it in elder law circles, though it's not a formal legal term, financial elder grooming. It's not always illegal, depending on what actually happened, but the fact that they conducted an unauthorized investigation into your finances, that they had legal paperwork prepared before you ever agreed to anything, that's significant. That tells me this wasn't spontaneous generosity gone wrong. This was planned. Hearing someone else say it out loud, someone with no emotional stake in my family at all, someone whose job it was to look at situations like mine with cold, clear eyes, that did something to me. It made it real in a way that even standing under that spotlight hadn't quite managed to. For 3 weeks, I'd been telling myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe grief and loneliness had made me paranoid. Maybe there was some version of events where my children's behavior could still be explained away as clumsy love instead of calculated exploitation. Margaret Liu took that last excuse away from me, gently but completely. I want to make sure you're protected going forward, she said. First, I'd recommend we update your estate planning documents immediately. Your will, any power of attorney designations, beneficiary forms on your accounts, all of it. If your children already know you have substantial liquid assets and they've already demonstrated a willingness to pressure you for access to them, we need to make sure your wishes are airtight and impossible to contest later. You think they'd contest my will? I asked, and even as I said it, even as the words left my mouth, I understood how naive the question sounded. Margaret's expression was kind but unflinching. Mrs. Hayes, I think the people who built an entire fundraising event around your finances, who hired someone to dig into your accounts without your knowledge, who had legal paperwork prepared before you ever walked through the door, I think those are people who don't give up easily when they believe money is owed to them. I'd rather we be prepared than surprised. I left her office that day with a list of next steps, and for the first time since that gold foil envelope had landed in my mailbox, I felt something other than grief or anger. I felt purpose. Over the following weeks, I did exactly what Margaret advised. I opened new bank accounts at a different institution entirely, somewhere Vanessa and Brandon had no existing relationship with anyone on staff, no way to call in a favor or pull information through some back channel. I began the slow, careful process of rewriting my will, and when Margaret asked me, gently, whether I wanted to leave anything in place for my children at all, I sat with that question for a long time before I answered. I don't want to punish them out of spite, I told her. I'm not interested in revenge, but I'm interested in protecting myself, and I think for the first time in my life that has to come before being interested in protecting them. That's not selfish, Mrs. Hayes, Margaret said. That's overdue. I changed the locks on my apartment, which felt almost silly until I remembered that Brandon had a key from years earlier, back when he used to check on the place when I traveled, back when there was still trust between us worth handing a key over for. I blocked both their numbers, not out of anger exactly, but because every time my phone lit up with Vanessa's name or Brandon's name, something in my chest seized up with old, exhausting hope, and I was tired, finally, of having my heart yanked around by people who'd already shown me exactly what they thought I was worth. It didn't stop them, of course. People like that, and I say this now with the clarity of someone who's had time to sit with it, people who've decided you owe them something rarely accept silence as an answer. They tried different numbers. Vanessa showed up at my apartment building once, buzzing my unit over and over until I finally picked up the intercom, my voice steadier than I expected, and told her I had nothing further to say to her, and that if she kept showing up uninvited, I would call the building manager. You're really going to do this? She said, her voice tinny and distorted through the cheap intercom speaker, but the hurt in it unmistakable even through the static. You're really going to throw away your whole family over money? I'm not the one who threw away the family, Vanessa, I said. I just finally noticed it had already happened. I disconnected the call and stood there in my hallway for a long moment, breathing hard, my heart pounding the way it always did after any encounter with either of my children now. Even the brief ones, even the ones conducted entirely through an intercom speaker. Some habits don't die just because you've decided they should. The real escalation came about 6 weeks after the party, and it came in a form I genuinely hadn't anticipated, even after everything. I came home from my Tuesday matinee with Carol to find a thick envelope waiting in my mailbox, and my stomach dropped the second I saw the return address. A law firm, not Margaret's, somewhere I'd never heard of before, with a name I didn't recognize at the top of the letterhead. I sat down at my kitchen table and opened it with hands that had gone cold, despite the October warmth still lingering outside. And as I read, I understood I'd badly underestimated exactly how far my children were willing to go. It was a legal letter from Brandon's attorney, alleging, and I remember the exact word choice because I read it so many times it burned itself into my memory, alleging that I had a pattern of abandoning my family responsibilities, that my absence from my grandchildren's lives constituted a form of estrangement I had chosen, and that given my age and what the letter delicately called my diminished social support network, there were concerns about my capacity to make sound financial decisions independently. The letter requested a formal evaluation of my mental competency, citing my abrupt and erratic departure from Vanessa's birthday celebration as evidence of a possible cognitive or emotional decline that warranted oversight. I sat there in my kitchen and read that letter 3 times before the full shape of what they were doing settled into me completely. They weren't just asking for money anymore. They were trying to have me declared incompetent. I called Margaret immediately, my hand shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. And when she picked up and I read the letter to her, line by line, I heard her go very quiet on the other end, the particular quiet of a professional recalibrating how serious a situation actually was. "Eleanor," she said, and it was the first time she'd called me by my first name, "I want you to understand something. This is an aggressive move. It's not uncommon in cases like this, unfortunately. When families realize they can't access an elderly parent's assets through persuasion, sometimes they pivot to trying to access them through the courts instead by challenging the parent's competency. But I want to be very clear with you. Based on everything you've told me, based on the clarity and consistency of every decision you've made over the last 6 weeks, I don't believe for 1 second that any competent doctor or judge is going to look at your case and see anything other than exactly what it is: a sound, capable woman protecting her own assets from family members who tried to exploit her. They want to take away my right to make my own decisions," I said, and the disbelief in my own voice still surprises me when I think back on it, even now. My own children, because I said no to handing over $200,000. "I know," Margaret said, "and we're going to fight it. But Eleanor, I need you to brace yourself, because this is likely going to get worse before it gets better. People who try this kind of thing once rarely stop after the first attempt fails. We need to be ready for whatever they try next." I hung up the phone that evening and sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, the legal letter spread out on the table in front of me, my mother's empty jewelry box. The duplicate I'd had made after losing the original to that gift table I never went back for. Sitting beside it like a strange, quiet witness to everything that had happened. 20 years of silence. A birthday invitation built on a lie. A spotlight, a paperwork ambush, a demand for $200,000 dressed up as family reunion. And now, when all of that had failed, my own children had decided the next step was to question whether I was even sane enough to be trusted with my own life. I thought about Walter that night more than I had in years, wondering what he would have made of the 2 people we'd raised together, wondering if he'd have recognized them at all in that ballroom, under that spotlight, demanding their mother's life savings and then her sanity when the money wasn't handed over fast enough. I didn't sleep that night either. But somewhere around 3 in the morning, sitting in the dark with that legal letter still spread out in front of me, something settled into me that hadn't been there before. Not just anger anymore, not just grief, but a kind of cold, steady resolve I hadn't known I was capable of. They had taken 20 years from me already. I had let them, because some desperate, hopeful part of me had never stopped believing they'd come back to me on their own. I was done waiting for that now. And as I sat there in the dark, turning that legal letter over in my hands one more time, I understood, with a certainty that felt almost peaceful despite everything, that whatever came next, whatever they tried, I would not be the same frightened, hopeful woman who'd opened that gold foil envelope 6 weeks earlier. That woman had walked into Vanessa's house still believing love could survive almost anything. The woman sitting at that kitchen table now understood that some people don't actually want your love at all. They just want what your love makes you willing to give up. Margaret filed our response to that competency letter within the week. And I want to tell you, the process of fighting back against your own children in writing does something strange to a person. It doesn't feel like victory even when you know you're right. It feels like grief wearing a different coat. The response Margaret drafted was thorough. A formal rebuttal citing my independent management of my own finances for the past 2 decades, my clean credit history, the fact that I'd lived alone, paid my own bills, made my own medical decisions, driven my own car, all without a single documented incident suggesting impairment of any kind. She attached a letter from my longtime physician, Dr. Patterson, who'd known me for 15 years and wrote, in his characteristically blunt way, that he'd seen sharper minds in patients half my age and considered the suggestion of cognitive decline medically unsupported and frankly insulting. I remember sitting in Margaret's office while she read that line out loud and laughing for the first time in weeks, A real laugh, surprising myself with the sound of it. Dr. Patterson always did have a way with words, I said. He did us a favor, Margaret said. Judges read between the lines too. A formal medical opinion this direct tends to end these things quickly, especially when there's no actual evidence behind the allegation in the first place. She was right, mostly. The competency challenge fizzled within a month, quietly withdrawn by Brandon's attorney, once it became clear there was no medical ground to stand on. No judge likely to entertain the idea that a woman who'd independently managed her finances for 20 years had suddenly, conveniently, become incompetent the exact moment she refused to hand over $200,000. I want to tell you, I felt triumphant when Margaret called to tell me it had been dropped. Mostly what I felt was tired, the particular exhaustion of having had to prove, in writing, with medical documentation, that I was still allowed to be the owner of my own mind. I thought, foolishly, that this might finally be the end of it. I should have known better by then. I really should have. It was Brandon who escalated next, and it came almost 4 months after the party, in the dead of winter, on a gray February afternoon when I'd nearly let myself believe the worst of it was over. I was at Carol's kitchen table, the two of us working our way through a crossword puzzle, the way we did most Sunday afternoons, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was from Brandon's wife, Jessica, someone I'd met exactly twice in my life, both times briefly, both times years ago. The text was short, and I'd later understand deliberately cruel in its brevity. You should know Brandon's filing a lawsuit against you. He says you abandoned this family, and now you're trying to cut us out of what's rightfully ours. I think you should reconsider before this gets ugly. I read it 3 times before I fully absorbed it. Carol, watching my face change, set down her pen. Eleanor, what is it? I handed her the phone without a word, my hands gone cold the way they always did now whenever my children's names appeared on a screen. That particular dread I'd never quite gotten used to, no matter how many months passed. A lawsuit, Carol said slowly, reading it twice herself. Eleanor, what could he possibly be suing you for? You haven't taken anything from him. You've just refused to give him something he had no right to ask for in the first place. I didn't have an answer for her, not that day. I called Margaret first thing the next morning, and her voice on the phone had a weariness in it I hadn't heard before. The particular weariness of someone who'd seen this pattern enough times to recognize it instantly. It's called a constructive abandonment claim, she explained, once she'd had a chance to review the filing that arrived at her office 2 days later. Brandon's attorney is arguing that you walked away from your parental responsibilities decades ago, essentially trying to flip the entire narrative, claiming that you abandoned him and Vanessa emotionally and financially when they were younger, and that this most recent investment opportunity was actually an attempt by them to repair that relationship, which you then rejected, causing them what the filing describes as significant emotional and financial harm. Financial harm, I repeated, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. I never gave them a single dollar. How is refusing to hand over my own savings causing them financial harm? The filing claims the Coal Coastal project suffered because the anticipated investment fell through, and that Brandon and Vanessa had made financial commitments based on the expectation that you'd contribute, commitments they now can't fulfill. Margaret's voice had an edge of disbelief in it, even as she explained it, like she still couldn't quite believe the audacity of what she was reading. Essentially, Eleanor, they're trying to argue that by saying no, you damaged them financially, and that years of, in their words, parental neglect and emotional abandonment entitle them to compensation now. I sat in my kitchen holding that phone and felt something in me that had been holding steady for months finally start to crack. Not from sadness this time, but from a kind of disbelieving fury I'd never experienced in my entire life. 20 years of being the one who called, who mailed gifts, who showed up at every milestone whether invited or not, who carried the entire weight of a relationship 2 other people had long since abandoned. And now, because I'd finally refused to keep paying for the privilege of being ignored, I was the one being sued for abandonment. They want to make it official, I said slowly, understanding dawning even as I spoke the words out loud. They want a court to say, in writing, that I'm the one who failed them. That way, no matter what happens with the money, they get to walk away believing they were right about me all along. That may be part of it, Margaret said carefully. But Eleanor, I also think there's a simpler explanation. I think they believe that if they can convince a judge you abandoned them, there's a chance, slim, but a chance, that some portion of your estate or your current assets could be awarded to them as compensation. It's a long shot. But people who've already shown a willingness to manufacture an entire birthday party as a financial trap, Eleanor, those aren't people who give up easily on a long shot. I want to tell you about the months that followed, because this is the part of the story that still exhausts me most when I think back on it, more than the spotlight, more than the legal letters, more than even the competency challenge. It was the slow, grinding process of discovery, depositions, document requests, hours spent in Margaret's office going through 20 years of phone records, 20 years of receipts for gifts mailed and never acknowledged, 20 years of evidence I'd never imagined I would need to prove the simplest, most painful fact of my life, that I had loved my children desperately, consistently, and almost entirely without reciprocation. Margaret had me compile everything. Every phone bill showing calls placed to Vanessa's number, year after year, dozens of calls some months, calls that lasted 4 minutes, 2 minutes, sometimes mere seconds before going to voicemail. Receipts for the quilt I'd sent Madison, the leather wallet for Tyler, gifts purchased and shipped and never once acknowledged with so much as a thank you text. Christmas cards I'd kept carbon copies of, year after year, the handwriting growing a little shakier each year, but the sentiment never changing. I love you. I miss you. Please call when you have a chance. Sitting across from Margaret's paralegal one afternoon, watching her organize 20 years of my heartbreak into neat labeled folders for a court case I never wanted to be part of, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not vindication exactly. Something closer to grief for the woman I'd been all those years, dialing a phone number over and over, hoping each time would be different. You kept all of this, the paralegal said at one point, looking up from a folder thick with old greeting cards, an odd note of something like awe in her voice. 20 years of cards. Most people don't keep things this organized. I didn't keep them for a lawsuit, I said quietly. I kept them because some part of me always believed I'd get to show my grandchildren someday. I thought I'd get to say, look, I never stopped thinking about you, even when you didn't know I existed. The deposition itself, when it finally happened, was one of the hardest days of my entire life, harder even than that spotlight at the party, because at least at the party I'd had the adrenaline of shock to carry me through. The deposition was slow and clinical and merciless in its own quiet way. Brandon's attorney walking me through 20 years of my own life, question by question, trying to find some crack in the story, some inconsistency he could use to paint me as the villain in my own children's narrative. Isn't it true, Mrs. Hayes, that you and your daughter had a strained relationship even before your husband's death? We had disagreements, the way every mother and daughter do. That's not the same as abandonment. And isn't it true that you sometimes called multiple times in a single day, which your daughter has described as feeling, in her words, suffocating? I sat with that question for a moment longer than I needed to, feeling the old, familiar guilt try to climb back up my throat. The same guilt I'd felt standing in that ballroom listening to Brandon tell me I'd made his childhood unbearable. There were periods after my husband died, I said finally, when I called more than usual. Yes, I was grieving, and I leaned on my children more than I probably should have. I've acknowledged that, and I'm not proud of it. But there's a difference between a grieving mother calling too often during the hardest years of her life and a grieving mother who then gets punished with 20 years of silence as the consequence. One mistake, made out of grief, does not erase 2 decades of effort to repair it. Brandon's attorney moved on, but I caught, just for a moment, a flicker of something in Margaret's expression beside me. Pride, maybe, or relief. The look of someone watching a client find their footing exactly when it mattered most. The case dragged on for nearly 4 months. I won't walk you through every motion, every filing, every long, anxious evening spent waiting for news from Margaret's office, because honestly, even now, some of it blurs together in my memory. The particular gray fog of a legal battle that takes far longer than the wound it's meant to address. What I will tell you about is the day everything finally came to a head, the day we stood before a judge for what Margaret called the dispositive hearing, the day the entire weight of 20 years finally got laid out, side by side, for someone with the authority to actually weigh it. Vanessa and Brandon were both there, sitting at the opposing table with their attorney. And I want to tell you something about seeing them again in that courtroom 4 months after that ballroom. They looked smaller somehow, the polish dulled slightly by months of legal proceedings that hadn't gone the way they'd hoped, by mounting attorney fees, by the slow realization, I think, that this had not been the easy windfall they'd imagined when they sent that gold foil envelope to my door. Vanessa wouldn't quite meet my eyes when I walked in. Brandon stared at the table in front of him, jaw tight, the same expression he'd worn that night under the spotlight when his careful script had started falling apart in front of 200 witnesses. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman named Judge Alvarez, who'd clearly read every piece of the substantial file in front of her, did not waste time with pleasantries. She went through the record methodically, the phone log showing 2 decades of calls placed and largely unanswered, the gifts purchased and never acknowledged, the testimony from Carol, who'd taken the stand and described, in her careful schoolteacher's voice, years of watching me cry after unreturned calls, years of birthdays spent in quiet apartments instead of with family. She reviewed the timeline of the party itself, the financial investigation conducted without my knowledge or consent, the paperwork prepared before I'd ever agreed to anything, the competency challenge filed the moment financial pressure failed. "I want to be very direct," Judge Alvarez said, looking up from her notes, her gaze moving deliberately between Vanessa and Brandon, "because I think the record here speaks for itself in a way that doesn't require much elaboration from me. What I see in this file is not a case of parental abandonment. What I see is 20 years of consistent, documented effort by Mrs. Hayes to maintain a relationship with her children, met largely with silence, followed by a sudden, calculated reconnection that occurred at the precise moment her children's business venture required substantial capital. I see an unauthorized financial investigation into an elderly woman's private assets. I see a public confrontation designed, by the defendant's own admission and deposition, to create social pressure to secure a financial commitment. And when that failed, I see a competency challenge with no medical basis whatsoever, followed by this lawsuit, which asks this court to retroactively recharacterize 20 years of a mother's devotion as neglect, apparently in the hope that doing so might still entitle the plaintiffs to some portion of her estate. The courtroom had gone very quiet. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, hardly daring to breathe, watching this stranger in a black robe say out loud, in a room full of witnesses, every single thing I'd spent 20 years too afraid or too hopeful to say myself. "This claim is dismissed in its entirety," Judge Alvarez continued. "Furthermore, given the pattern documented here, the unauthorized financial investigation, the staged confrontation at a social event, the baseless competency challenge, and now this retaliatory lawsuit, I am granting the protective order requested by Mrs. Hayes' counsel. Mr. Hayes and Mrs. Cole are hereby prohibited from contacting Mrs. Hayes directly, from approaching her residence, or from attempting any further legal action regarding her finances or her estate without proper legal cause, which, I will note for the record, does not currently exist." I felt the words land in me slowly, like something thawing after a long, hard freeze. Dismissed. Protective order. The case, finally, completely, over. Brandon's face had gone pale. Vanessa, beside him, had pressed a hand over her mouth, and for just a second, before she controlled her expression again, I saw something there that looked almost like the daughter I remembered, the little girl who used to cry when she got in trouble. Except this time the trouble was entirely of her own making, built brick by brick over months of choices that had led her exactly here. "Mrs. Hayes," Judge Alvarez said, turning to me directly, her voice softening just slightly, "I want to say, for the record, that the court recognizes the difficulty of what you've endured here, both personally and now legally. You are owed nothing further by this family beyond what you choose to give, and I hope you understand that clearly." I nodded because I couldn't quite trust my voice yet, and beside me, Margaret reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, a gesture that said everything words couldn't have in that moment. We walked out of that courthouse together into a cold, bright March afternoon, and I stood on the steps for a long moment, breathing in air that felt different somehow than it had in months, lighter, like something heavy I'd been carrying without fully realizing its weight had finally been set down. "It's over," Margaret said beside me. Really over, Eleanor. They can't come after you again. Not without real legal cause, and after this ruling, that's going to be extremely difficult for them to manufacture. I thought, standing there, of the woman who'd opened that gold foil envelope 6 months earlier, hands shaking with hope, already building an entire reunion in her mind before she'd even read the second line. I thought of her climbing those marble steps toward Vanessa's glowing white house, clutching her mother's pearls against her chest like an offering. I thought of how completely, devastatingly wrong that woman had been about what was waiting for her inside. And I thought about who I'd had to become in the months since just to survive what came after. For the first time since that envelope arrived, I let myself imagine an actual future. Not the desperate borrowed from hope future I'd built in my mind that sleepless night before the party, full of grandchildren I'd never met and reconciliations that existed only in my imagination, but something quieter, something real, something built entirely on my own terms for the first time in 20 years. I didn't know yet exactly what that future would look like. I only knew, standing on those courthouse steps with Margaret beside me and a protective order finally between myself and the two people who'd spent 6 months trying to take everything I had left, that whatever came next, it would be mine. Entirely, finally, mine. Spring came slowly that year, the way it always does, but I noticed it more than I had in a long time. The way the light changed in my little apartment, the way the air outside my kitchen window stopped biting and started softening. I'd like to tell you that the moment Judge Alvarez's gavel came down, all the grief I'd been carrying simply lifted away. But that's not how healing works, not the real kind. The lawsuit was over, the protective order was in place. And still, some nights, I'd find myself standing in front of my closet, looking at that emerald green dress hanging untouched since the party, and feeling the old ache rise up in my chest before I could stop it. Grief doesn't follow a court schedule. I learned that slowly, over the months that followed, sitting with Carol on her porch some evenings, saying very little, just letting the quiet do the work that words couldn't. But something had shifted in me permanently, and I want to try to describe it honestly, because I think it's the most important part of everything I'm telling you. For 20 years, my entire sense of worth had been tangled up in whether my children loved me back. Every birthday I spent alone, I measured against some imagined version of myself who'd done something to deserve it. Every unanswered call, I turned inward, wondering what I'd failed to give them, what piece of myself I hadn't offered generously enough. I had spent 2 decades treating my own children's silence as a referendum on my value as a human being. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to a stranger in a black robe list out, methodically, everything that had actually been done to me, I finally understood something I should have understood years earlier. Their silence had never been about my worth at all. It had been about theirs, about what kind of people they'd chosen to become, and what they'd decided I was useful for, and what they were willing to do once they discovered I might not be useful in the way they'd hoped. That spring, I made a decision that surprised even me, considering how raw everything still felt. I sold my apartment. It wasn't a decision born of fear, despite what it might sound like. Margaret had assured me repeatedly that the protective order gave me real, enforceable protection, that Vanessa and Brandon legally could not contact me or approach me without consequence. But I'd spent 20 years in that small 2-bedroom apartment that had become, without my fully realizing it, a museum of waiting. Every room held some memory of a phone call I'd made from that exact spot, hoping someone would answer, of a birthday card I'd addressed at that very kitchen table, of nights spent staring at a phone that never rang. I wanted a life that didn't have those ghosts woven into the walls. Carol thought I was being impulsive at first, and she said so gently, the way she said most hard things. Eleanor, you've been through an enormous amount this year. Maybe this isn't the time for big decisions. I think it's exactly the time, I told her. I've spent 20 years making small, careful decisions, waiting for permission from people who were never going to give it. I'm tired of being careful, Carol. I want to actually live somewhere I chose, for reasons that are entirely mine. I found a small house on the coast, 3 hours from the city I'd lived in my entire adult life, in a quiet town with a single main street, a bakery that opened at 6 in the morning, and a beach close enough that I could hear the waves at night with my windows cracked open. It wasn't grand. It wasn't anything like the glittering estate I'd driven up to that October evening, all white stone and gold light spilling from enormous windows. It was small and a little weathered and entirely, completely mine, bought with money nobody had pressured me into spending, in a place nobody had chosen for me. I legally changed my name that summer too, and I think this is the part of the story people find hardest to understand. So let me try to explain it the way I explained it to Margaret when I first brought it up. It's not about hiding, I told her. I'm not running from anything, not really. I just think Eleanor Hayes belonged to a whole life that included being someone's overlooked, underappreciated mother, calling and never getting an answer. I'd like to be someone new. Someone who gets to decide for the first time what her own life actually looks like. I became Vivian Brooks that summer. Vivian, a name I'd always loved as a girl and never used. Brooks, my own mother's maiden name. Something that connected me backward to a woman who'd raised me with far less than I had and never once let me doubt that I was loved. It felt less like erasing myself and more like finally choosing myself. On purpose, with both hands. I rewrote my will completely that year, with Margaret's careful guidance, and this is the part I think matters most, the part I most want you to understand, because it isn't about punishment. I want to be very clear about that. I didn't restructure my estate out of spite or revenge, though I won't pretend the thought of cutting Vanessa and Brandon out entirely didn't cross my mind during the darkest weeks of that lawsuit. What I actually did in the end was something quieter, and I think more meaningful. I established a small foundation. Nothing grand, nothing with my new name plastered across a building somewhere. Just a modest fund dedicated to supporting elderly women who found themselves isolated, financially vulnerable, or estranged from family later in life. Women like me. Women who'd spent decades giving everything they had to people who eventually decided they weren't worth keeping around, only to find themselves alone in their 60s and 70s with nothing but silence and a phone that never rang. The foundation helps with small things, mostly legal consultations for women facing exactly the kind of situation I'd faced, modest grants to help cover housing costs for women who'd been financially exploited by family members, a support network connecting isolated older women with others who understood, without explanation needed, exactly what that particular kind of loneliness felt like. It's not enormous. It will never make headlines. But every time I sign off on a small grant for some woman I've never met, going through something I understand far too well, I feel something settle in me that 200 unanswered phone calls never could have given me. Purpose. Usefulness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. I want to pause here and say something directly to whoever's listening to this, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. If you are an older person, watching your own children treat your love like a resource to be extracted rather than a relationship to be honored, I need you to hear this clearly. Your worth was never contingent on their willingness to answer the phone. You do not owe anyone your life savings in exchange for the privilege of being treated like family. Love that only shows up when it wants something is not love. It's a transaction wearing love's clothing, and you are under no obligation to pay it. I rebuilt my life that year, piece by piece, in that small coastal house with the bakery down the street and the ocean close enough to hear at night. Carol visited often, taking the train down on weekends, and we'd walk along the water in the evenings the way we used to walk to the matinee on Tuesdays. Except now there was no old apartment waiting for either of us. No ghosts in the walls, just open air and salt water, and a quiet that finally felt peaceful instead of lonely. I made new friends in that town faster than I expected to. A retired nurse named Dorothy who lived 2 houses down and brought me tomatoes from her garden every August. A younger woman named Priya who ran the bakery and always saved me the good seat by the window. A whole small community of people who knew me only as Vivian, who had no memory of a desperate woman crying in a department store dressing room over an emerald dress she couldn't quite afford. They knew me as someone whole. I'd never had that before. Not really. Not since Walter died. It was almost 2 years after that birthday party, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when a letter arrived that I almost didn't open. I recognized the handwriting immediately, even after everything, even after the new name and the new house and the new life I'd built so carefully out of the wreckage of the old one. It was Vanessa's. Forwarded through Margaret's office, since that was the only address either of my children had any legal way of reaching, a careful arrangement Margaret had set up specifically to maintain the protective order while still allowing for the possibility, however unlikely, that genuine communication might someday occur. I sat with that letter unopened for 3 full days before I finally found the courage to read it. When I did, sitting alone at my kitchen table with the ocean visible through the window, I found something I genuinely hadn't expected. Not another attempt to manipulate me. Not another carefully worded request disguised as reconciliation. It was, as far as I could tell, an actual apology. Messy, imperfect, clearly difficult for her to write, full of admissions I never thought I'd see in my daughter's handwriting. She wrote about the divorce. Richard had left the year before, apparently, the coal coastal project having collapsed entirely under the weight of mounting debts, and a business partner who'd turned out to be far less honest than he'd seemed. She wrote about therapy, about finally sitting with a counselor who'd helped her understand the patterns she'd grown up in, the way her own father's death had reshaped the household into something colder, more transactional, and how she'd absorbed that coldness without ever fully recognizing it in herself until it was too late to undo the damage it had caused. She wrote that she understood, finally, what she'd actually done that night under the spotlight, not just asked for money, but weaponized 20 years of my loneliness against me, dressed cruelty up as opportunity, and called it love because it was easier than admitting what it actually was. "I am not asking you to let me back into your life," she wrote, near the end of that letter. And I remember reading that line 3 or 4 times because some part of me had braced myself, even after everything, for exactly that request. I know I don't have the right to ask for that, not after everything I did. I just needed you to know that I see it now. All of it. What I did, and why it was wrong, and what it cost you, and what it's cost me too, even though I don't think I deserve any sympathy for that part of it. I cried reading that letter, the way I'd cried so many times throughout this entire ordeal, but it was a different kind of crying than before, not the desperate, hopeful tears of a woman waiting by a phone. Something quieter, something almost like grief for a relationship that might, in some better version of the world, have existed differently. I want to tell you honestly what I did next, because I think it matters more than any dramatic reconciliation scene might. I didn't write back immediately. I sat with that letter for weeks, turning it over in my mind, talking it through with Carol on one of her weekend visits, walking along the beach in the evenings trying to understand what I actually wanted, separate from what I'd once desperately needed. Eventually, I did write back. A short letter, careful, honest. I told Vanessa I believed her apology was sincere. I told her I forgave her, not because she'd earned forgiveness through some grand gesture, but because I'd realized, somewhere in that small coastal house with the ocean outside my window, that carrying 20 years of anger forward into whatever life I had left wasn't a punishment for her. It was a punishment for me. But I also told her, as clearly and gently as I could manage, that forgiveness and reconciliation were not the same thing, and that I had no intention of rebuilding a relationship that had cost me so much to finally walk away from. Some bridges, once burned, are better left as ash. Not because the person on the other side doesn't deserve a chance at redemption somewhere in their own life, but because some chapters are simply finished and trying to force them back open rarely serves anyone well. I never heard from Brandon at all, not directly, not through Margaret's office, not in any form. I understand he eventually divorced Jessica as well, that the lawsuit and its aftermath had cost him more than just legal fees, that whatever foundation his marriage had been built on hadn't survived watching him try to drag his own mother through court over money she'd earned and saved across an entire lifetime. I don't know if he's changed the way Vanessa seems to have changed. I suspect, honestly, that he hasn't. Not really. And I've made my peace with the fact that some people simply never circle back to the truth about themselves, no matter how much time passes or how much they lose along the way. I want to talk now about what I've actually learned from all of this, because I think that's really why you've stayed with me this far into the story, and I don't want to leave you without it. Love is not a transaction. I cannot say that clearly enough, cannot say it loudly enough. For anyone listening who might be sitting somewhere right now in a quiet apartment of their own, wondering whether they owe their children financial access to their life savings as some kind of penance for not being close enough, not being there enough, not having given enough across the years. You do not. Real love does not arrive with a balance sheet attached. It does not wait 20 years in silence and then materialize, conveniently, the exact moment it needs something from you. If the people in your life only reach for you when their hands are empty, that tells you everything you need to know about what they actually wanted all along. Boundaries are not cruelty. I spent decades believing that setting limits with my own children would somehow make me a worse mother, that real love meant endless availability, endless forgiveness, endless willingness to be hurt again and again in exchange for the smallest crumb of connection. I was wrong about that, and it took me 69 years and one devastating birthday party to finally understand it. Protecting yourself from people who consistently choose to harm you is not a failure of love. It is, I've come to believe, one of the most important forms love can take. The love you finally learn to give yourself, after decades of pouring it exclusively into people who never once thought to pour any of it back. And dignity, your right to your own assets, your own decisions, your own life, even at 69, even at 70, even at 90, if you're fortunate enough to live that long, dignity does not expire with age. Nobody gets to decide simply because you've accumulated enough years that your judgment matters less than it used to, that your money belongs more to your children's ambitions than to your own security and peace. I fought for that dignity in a courtroom I never wanted to set foot in, against two people I'd once held as newborns in my arms, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, because some things are worth fighting for even when the people you're fighting are your own blood. I'm 71 years old now, sitting in a small house by the ocean that nobody chose for me, surrounded by friends who know me as exactly who I decided to become rather than who I was expected to remain. Dorothy still brings me tomatoes every August. Priya still saves me the good seat by the window. Carol visits most weekends, and some mornings we walk along the water before the bakery even opens, talking about nothing important, which is its own kind of luxury after everything that came before. I celebrated my last birthday on that beach, surrounded by the people who actually chose to show up for me. Not out of obligation, not because blood demanded it, but because somewhere along the way, in this quiet life I built entirely on my own terms, I'd finally found the kind of family that doesn't require 20 years of unanswered phone calls to prove itself. Watching the sunrise that morning, coffee in hand, the ocean turning gold the way it does just before the sun fully clears the horizon, I understood something I don't think I could have understood any earlier in my life, not without everything that came before it. I hadn't lost my children, not really, not in the way I'd grieved for so many years lying awake in that old apartment, wondering what I'd done wrong, wondering what piece of myself I'd failed to give generously enough. They had lost something instead. They had lost a mother who would have walked through fire for them without asking for anything in return, who'd spent 20 years proving that devotion in 100 small, unanswered ways, who would have given them everything she had, freely, gladly, if they had simply asked with love instead of calculation. And by finally walking away, by finally choosing my own dignity over their convenience, I hadn't lost a family at all. I had found myself fully, for the first time since Walter died, sitting on a beach that was entirely mine, in a life I'd built with my own two hands, owing nothing to anyone who hadn't earned the privilege of my devotion. That, I've come to believe, is the only inheritance that ever really mattered.